military's point of view. They get in, they sign in, or they get drafted. They do what they're supposed to do. If they get killed, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. Let them go after that. Send them back out to cope for themselves, and that's not good enough.
From 1965 to 1975, the United States was engaged in one of the most ferocious wars in its history, the War in Vietnam. This bloody incursion caused the deaths of almost 60,000 American soldiers. The questionable motives and inhumane tactics of this war caused many people to see the U.S. government in a different way.
My father, grown up in a very different country, and had volunteered to be drafted in World War II. And World War II, it was the good war, and so most of the Vietnam vets were the sons of the men and the women who served in World War II. And so it took us a long time to get out of that mindset, America, love it or leave it.
Towards the end of the late 50s into the early 60s, virtually all Americans trusted the government. It was, I think, post-World War II, belief in the power and strength and goodness of the government and, the United States of America. I was in elementary school for those years, and so that's what we were taught. Arriving in Vietnam and observing what we were doing, not only to the soldiers that we were continuing to send there, but what we were doing to the people and the country of Vietnam, made me begin to question all that I had been taught about the United States of America.
To understand America's motives at the time, in the late 60s, it was hard to understand what we were trying to achieve. In other words, did we have a set of circumstances under which we would consider this to be won, to be over? And we didn't seem to.
The devices used in this conflict were oftentimes composed of horrid and inhumane tactics, which many times caused the deaths of civilians.
I will just tell you, as somebody who was a little kid then, one of the most powerful images for me, and I think it was in Life magazine, I don't remember, but after the U.S. had dropped napalm, there's an image of a girl, she was probably about 10, running, badly burned, and just running and screaming, and that picture, that photograph, and getting a better understanding of the tactics of the war.
The war really active, as I mentioned. The Marines went in March 1965. Saigon fell in April of 1975. That was 10 years. And that 10-year period could be divided into 3 sections. The troops that went over there from 65 to 67, the guys who were in the thick of it from 67 to 69, and then those of us who were there after Lyndon Johnson chose not to run for his second term, after we had begun to hear about what was going on in Vietnam, after the My Lai massacre, everybody was questioning, and yet we were there.
Along with these changes in Vietnam, the general feelings of the American public began to shift parallel to the events in combat.
The troops that were there early on came back to the States and were not disrespected. They were still respected. As the word got out about the war in 68, 69, My Lai, the American people, furious about the war, and not all the American people, but certain segments of the population angry about the war, turned that anger against the soldiers. And so they were significantly disrespected.
This change in the public's opinion led the way for the anti-war movement to come into full swing.
The anti-war movement, much of what I think gave rise to protests were a couple of things. Was the use of the draft, the use of conscription. And if you notice, we don't have a draft anymore, and that's part of the reason you don't see as much protest around war, because it's only, if you have a volunteer army, even if some folks are dragooned into volunteering, it's not the same. And so the lack of deferment for students, which had been the norm in previous wars, was really, I think, one of the catalysts. So the draft, coupled with The voting age being 21, I think specific to the movement is why so much of it took place on college campuses, that college-age men were no longer going to be able to defer, that they too were going to be drafted, and that they had no voice in choosing their political leaders was much of the reason why they protested. The other things, though, that I think one has to keep track of in thinking about this particular social movement was its timing, and that it was happening alongside or not much after the civil rights movement. And so there was a legacy, a history, a model of how to protest and affect social change. And the women's movement was probably not as good a parallel as the civil rights movement, but it really was a time and era of people using protest to try and affect change, people who didn't think they had voice in government. And so youth, 18 to 21-year-olds, understood themselves as similarly marginalized as African Americans had in the previous
Events in the
decade.
war, such as the My Lai massacre, in which members of a search and destroy mission killed dozens of civilians, contributed greatly to the growing anti-war movement. Then, in the spring mobilization to end the war event of April 19, 1967, a group of 5 veterans presenting a banner with the slogan "Vietnam Veterans Against the War" began the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organization. This new agent of the anti-war movement was important because now, not only were students and other regular citizens protesting, people who had actively served in Vietnam were telling the people of the U.S. of the atrocities they had seen. This was important because, even though this was considered the first televised war, much of the footage was still hugely edited in order to gain support of the people for the war effort. This organization was also important because it gave veterans a new way to cope with traumatizing events they experienced in Vietnam, while also allowing them to speak out against injustices they saw and were forced to participate in.
Why are there so many suicides? Why are so many veterans self-medicating with alcohol and with drugs, illegal or prescribed drugs? You have to start asking yourself those questions, and then you come up with a need for the type of organization that will advocate for them. Otherwise, they're disposable from the military's point of view. And there was also a deep kind of a resentment that not only that they had put me and people that I'd served with through this, but that they were preparing to do it to more people and more people and more people, and that the war was going to continue to go on. So protesting was a kind of an accepted way to deal with that.
The VVAW also participated in a number of anti-war protests. They orchestrated the famed occupation of the Statue of Liberty in 1971 and again in 1976, in which many members climbed to the top of the tower, barred themselves in, and hung a banner reading the words, "Extend the GI Bill." This massive public protest was vastly important because it gained recognition to both the anti-war movement and the VVAW. In addition to this, was possibly the most famous VVAW protest of the organization's history, Operation Dewey Canyon 3. This demonstration took place on the steps of the Capitol in April of 1971. The veterans first marched to the Capitol and set up camp, violating a court order prohibiting such events. They then began to reenact the violent firefights and search and destroy missions from Vietnam. Finally, they gathered in front of the Pentagon and, one by one, threw their discharge papers, ribbons, Purple Hearts, and other awards and mementos given to them during or after the war onto the steps of the Capitol, showing their disgust towards the war and their feelings of its illegitimacy. In the year 1971, all of the VVAW's actions combined to a climax in the Winter Soldier investigation. This was a gathering of vets from Vietnam to testify in front of Congress about the disgusting acts they participated in while deployed. This, for many, was the first time they had heard of the atrocities committed in this particular war, and it was revolutionary in the anti-war effort. Led by John Kerry, this testimony was absolutely jaw-dropping, as veterans told for the first time what they had been pushed to do during the war. People talked of how they would smile and take pictures with the people they had killed, and how they had shot civilians, all in the name of the United States of America. These people told stories that only those who had been deployed could have imagined, and the people were finally awakened to the carnage and slaughter that was occurring overseas. This event, combined with the protests of VVAW and other anti-war groups, played a major role in ending the Vietnam War and preventing further bloodshed. This organization and investigation have had long-term effects on the public. To this day, the VVAW continues to protest in favor of veterans and help them deal with struggles they face in day-to-day life that others don't have. And the Winter Soldier investigation has recreated itself in Iraq as veterans from that war returning home with similar feelings and types of stories as those who served